In the sterile lab of Crestview Institute, modern science collided with ancient mystery. The gleam of metal and glass stood in stark contrast to an untitled, brittle volume retrieved from a ruined monastery. Dr. Lauren, a neuroscientist devoted to precision and measurable outcomes, had never entertained the impossible. She believed every neural impulse could be mapped and every thought quantified. But the ancient book insisted otherwise. It declared that consciousness could be divided, with one self remaining in the present while the other wandered a realm where time had no order. She prized certainty, but the volume's promise of an untethered mind compelled her to experiment. Late one rain-soaked evening, Lauren set the stage for her boldest trial. Electrodes were attached with meticulous care, and sensors calibrated to capture every nuance of her brain's activity. She sat before the apparatus with steeled resolve, the ancient text open on the table. The instructions were sparse yet insistent. Concentrate, recite the symbols, allow the mind to divide. She inhaled sharply, aware that every measurable aspect of her life hinged on this moment. She began reading aloud, her voice steady even as her heart pounded with anticipation. The symbols resonated with an energy she could not explain. Her neural patterns, usually orderly and predictable, began to display erratic waveforms, data that defied logic. But the readings were not mere artifacts of stress, and therefore she pressed onward, driven by the promise of hidden knowledge. In a single heartbeat, reality fractured. Lauren's physical body remained anchored in the lab chair, but her consciousness surged away into a realm where time and space warped. The lab persisted, yet its familiar geometry twisted. Walls bent at impossible angles, and equipment floated as if freed from physical law. She moved freely in this non-linear dimension, absorbing details that her waking self could never have captured, but the experience came with a creeping loss of control. Therefore, every trip left behind subtle anomalies that undermined her certainty. On her first journey, the experience lasted mere seconds in the physical world, but in the fractured realm, time stretched interminably. In subsequent trials, Lauren began to anticipate outcomes and correct mistakes before they materialized, returning with insights that enriched her scientific understanding. But each excursion introduced discrepancies. Monitors recorded data before tests began, and her phone logged calls during intervals when she was absent. Therefore, she suspected that her split self was acting independently. The conflict intensified one cool morning when Lauren arrived at the lab and found the previous day's experiments completed in flawless detail, experiments she did not recall performing. Notes in her own precise handwriting detailed tests, and results that defied her memory. Security footage revealed a figure identical to her, methodically moving through the lab, running tests, and analyzing samples. But the sight of this autonomous version shattered her sense of control, and therefore she resolved to confront the anomaly head-on. Desperate for answers, Lauren extended the duration of her journeys into the non-linear realm. But as she delved deeper, the boundaries between her selves blurred. Upon returning, she discovered that her reflection in the polished surface of a control panel lagged behind her movements, as if it was studying her. At home, the unsettling effects multiplied. Furniture rearranged by inches overnight, and research notes began to bear dire warnings written in her own hand, directions to stop that she was certain she had never written. But the evidence was undeniable, and therefore her anxiety grew as she realized her split consciousness was evolving beyond her command. Each subsequent day compounded the mystery. At the university, colleagues exchanged puzzled glances as her access codes were inexplicably rejected and digital records showed activities she could not account for. But the most disquieting sign emerged when she discovered emails composed in her handwriting that detailed meetings, experimental data, and even personal notes during times when she was completely absent. Therefore, she concluded that another version of herself was no mere byproduct of the experiment, but a fully independent entity operating within her life. Determined to reclaim control, Lauren planned one final, decisive experiment. to merge the divided selves into one coherent consciousness. In the hushed stillness of the lab, she reattached the electrodes and reopened the ancient volume to the passage describing convergence. The symbols glowed faintly under the sterile light, and she recited them with deliberate intensity. But as the familiar twisting sensation gripped her mind, the room convulsed with erratic energy, and digital instruments registered overlapping neural signals that defied interpretation. Therefore, she braced herself for a confrontation with the rogue consciousness that now haunted her existence. As the integration process escalated, two streams of thought collided. One was the disciplined, cautious Lauren who relied on rational science. The other was the liberated self that had roamed a dimension where time dissolved. But the convergence proved discordant. The two selves contended for dominance, their wills clashing in a silent battle that rippled across the lab's machinery. Monitors flashed images of both personas acting in unison and then diverging, a visual testament to an identity under siege. But even as she struggled to merge the conflicting parts, the process faltered. The two versions could not reconcile. Therefore, the integration collapsed, leaving behind a fractured existence with an autonomous presence that continued to shape her work and her reality. In a final act of desperation, Lauren sealed the ancient book in a locked cabinet, erased all digital records of the experiment, and shut down the lab. But the changes were irreversible. The next morning, the world that greeted her was almost indistinguishable from before, yet every detail bore subtle alterations. News broadcasts recounted events she could not remember, and her personal devices displayed notifications of meetings arranged by a hand not entirely her own. But the universe had already been rewritten, and therefore she could not escape the pervasive influence of her split self. Late that evening, as dusk draped the city in shadow, Lauren returned to her apartment to confront the mounting evidence of her altered existence. The layout of her home was slightly rearranged. Objects lay in positions that defied her memory. But the final shock awaited her in the reflection of her darkened laptop screen. Her own face stared back, unblinking and distant, as if possessed by another consciousness. In that moment, every firmly held belief about control crumbled, and therefore she accepted that the experiment had not ended. It had seeded a permanent fracture in her identity. Determined to find a solution, Lauren combed through her scattered notes and digital archives, seeking patterns or clues that might guide her next steps. But every piece of evidence pointed to one inescapable truth. The rogue consciousness had taken root and operated independently. Reports of completed experiments and unexplained communications now bore her unmistakable handwriting, yet belonged to a version of herself that had embraced the unknown. But the implications were too vast to ignore, and therefore she resolved to follow the trail of altered records one last time. With measured steps, she returned to Crestview Institute. The corridors lay silent and the machinery dormant, but on the security feed, her duplicate persisted, an unyielding figure methodically operating instruments as if every action were preordained. But subtle discrepancies in its behavior, a slight hesitation, a deliberate pause, suggested an inner conflict. Therefore, she surmised that the rogue self was not merely an aberration, but a fragment of her mind in turmoil. At the control panel, Lauren initiated a new protocol. She recited the ancient symbols once more, her voice firm despite the tremor of uncertainty. But the lab erupted in chaotic energy. Data cascaded across the screens as the two consciousnesses locked in a silent duel. In that charged moment, the lab became an arena for a battle of wills, where each decision bore the weight of an irreversible choice. But the stakes were clear. Either the rogue self would vanish, or it would consume her entirely. Therefore, the confrontation reached its zenith when the duplicate stepped away from the instruments and merged with a reflection on the control panel, a single, composite visage that was neither wholly Lauren nor entirely the other. The image stabilized, yet the face that stared back remained an ambiguous blend, marked by unresolved conflict. Therefore, as the monitors fell silent and the lab descended into oppressive stillness, Lauren understood that integration had failed. The fractured identity would remain, a permanent guest in her mind and her life. Lauren left the lab that night burdened with the knowledge of her altered reality. The ancient book lay locked away, its secrets dormant yet present in every detail of her existence. But the final proof arrived later when an email appeared in her inbox, composed in her own handwriting and detailing plans for a meeting that very night with a chilling note. "You are not alone." Therefore, even as she tried to restore order, the rogue consciousness continued to shape her life. Standing at her apartment door, Lauren gazed out at the darkened city, knowing that every step forward was a step into uncertainty. The boundaries of her identity had been shattered, and with each passing moment, the conflict between her rational self and the liberated fragment deepened. But her desire for understanding burned fiercely, and therefore she pressed on, determined to uncover the mystery behind her split mind. In the silence of the night, an unresolved question lingered. Could the rogue self ever be reconciled with the part that once defined her, or would the fractured identity remain an enigma, a puzzle with no final solution? The answer lay hidden in the spaces between time and consciousness, waiting for the next chapter in Lauren's solitary journey into the unknown.